Hi, everyone. Welcome to the talk on building resilience, herbs for stress and burnout. My name is Dr. Emma Lee. I'm a naturopathic doctor in Vancouver, British Columbia. And without further ado, we're going to dive right in. Okay, so why stress and burnout as our very first webinar of 2025? And it's honestly because I see this so much in my practice. And I think a lot of people resonate with the sentiment that awareness regarding the effects of stress and increase in anxiety and depression has been on the rise for the past number of years. A lot of people will point to the pandemic, but I actually have seen it be on the rise for much longer than that. I think it's just the fast-paced nature of our modern society, and social media, multifactorial reasons, but it is definitely something that I see in my practice and something that's really, really prevalent in young people as well. So even though we talk about anxiety and depression as mental health condition, I really do feel that any of these different conditions exist on a spectrum. So it's not just disease or wellness, but there's an entire gray zone in between. And it really impacts not just mental health and cognition, but every aspect of our physiology. And I think that's why the effects of stress are so pervasive, because it's not just about our ability to focus, but it's about our immune function, our digestion, our hormones, our physiological health. When we see the next couple of slides, you'll see that it really impacts all the organ systems in the body. Okay, so this is a slide that I find really helpful in terms of framing how we can think about stress and our response to stress. So when we're talking about stress, we're really talking about this organ system called the adrenal glands, or the HPA axis specifically in the body. So the HPA refers to hypothalamus, pituitary adrenal axis, and it's essentially the communication between the brain and our adrenal glands, which then make our stress hormone cortisol. So stress is inherently neither good nor bad, and I don't think it's possible for us to change our stressors, but what we can certainly focus on is our stress response. So what happens in our bodies when we are met with the stress. So a healthy adrenal response is really a very elastic or flexible HPA axis where the cortisol is excreted in response to stress, but is able to come down very quickly after we meet those stressors. When we're in acute fight or flight, that's when there is a huge HPA activation, and so a huge cortisol surge. And that's largely okay because sometimes our stressors are larger. So maybe, for example, a deadline at work or a really stressful personal experience. But when we start getting into kind of the rest of that diagram, that's really when we consider there to be some dysfunction. So if that HPA axis is triggered constantly, so we're seeing a lot of activation in terms of cortisol surges in the body over the course of a day, or prolonged surges or lots of surges over time. And then that's when we can start to kind of fall down this gradient and enter adrenal dysfunction fatigue, and then established adrenal fatigue, which is at the very bottom. So just as a reminder, these are not medical terms. Your GP or family doctor would not know what you were talking about if you talked about adrenal fatigue, but this is really helpful, I think, for us to conceptualize the adrenal glands as not being an infinite source of cortisol, that they are, like any other organ system, finite in their ability to make cortisol and respond to stress. And so we definitely need to nourish the adrenal glands as a result of that. Okay, so a question that I get asked a lot in practice is, how do I know when I have high cortisol? Meaning, how do I know that my HPA axis is being triggered in that sort of fight or flight type of pattern? And how do I know when I'm so far down that sort of like dysregulation, either because of prolonged dysregulation or really, really like severe short-term stress? And how do I know when I've kind of tipped over into my adrenal glands are fatigued or they've been activated for a long period of time, and so they're no longer outputting enough cortisol? As a reminder, cortisol is not good or bad. We do need it for regular functioning. It is something that typically works on a 24-hour circadian rhythm. It's what gets us up and going in the morning. It should look like a peak first thing in the morning to get us out of bed and then falling gradually throughout the day. And so that's why we neither want like super, super high cortisol activation throughout the day, but we also don't desire low cortisol because that can look like chronic fatigue, frequent colds, immune dysregulation, increases in allergies. And I would say those three are probably really hallmark of low cortisol secondary to chronic overactivation of the HPA axis. You can probably tell from the graph, or not the graph, but the table, the chart, that a lot of the other ones do sort of overlap. So the food cravings, the weight gain, the insulin resistance, changes in blood pressure, short-term memory loss, poor concentration, those can occur either because of high cortisol or low cortisol, but that chronic fatigue, the immune dysregulation, I do see that as a little bit more hallmark of low cortisol. So just kind of a little bit of a review for you to assess whether or not you fall into one or the other, or neither, which would be great. Okay, so this is a very general overview of what we can do, all of the different ways we can support our bodies through stress and burnout. And of course, because this is a talk on herbs, we're going to focus on individual herbs for the majority of this presentation, but I did want to touch on 2/3 that I think are really, really foundational to how we approach recovery. And the analogy that I like to use is a bucket. So if you have a bucket that's completely empty, you're drained because you've been experiencing stress for a prolonged period of time, you could definitely use herbs or supplements or a medication to fill that bucket. And it's like using a shovel. You can fill that bucket pretty quickly in a shorter period of time. But once you get close to filling that bucket, it's really lovely to be able to maintain that full bucket, be able to pull back on the higher intervention practices, and to maintain that bucket through really foundational aspects of health. And that's really where the dietary habits, the lifestyle habits, they really come into play. So starting off with nutrition for stress support, two things, proteins and healthy fats are really, really key. One, because protein helps us to regulate blood sugar, and insulin regulation and blood sugar regulation really helps to support even cortisol release throughout the day. And then two, healthy fats, because cortisol is a fat-based molecule. It has a cholesterol as a backbone. So in order to make cortisol to feed that sort of like beautiful cortisol curve, we do need adequate healthy fats in our diet. And we're looking at aiming for roughly 1 to 2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day. If you are in pounds, or if you know your weight in pounds, it's roughly half of your weight to your full weight in terms of that number, translated in grams of protein. So if you were to do a quick Google search, you'll quickly notice that dinner most likely is your richest protein meal of the day, because most of us do eat either, animal proteins, or if we're vegetarian or vegan, we eat kind of our most nourishing meal in terms of like beans and legumes at dinner. But the grab and go lunch, and then certainly the breakfast, is where I see in clinic most of us do have a harder time to maintain that protein target. It's really hard to eat our entire daily quota of protein in one meal because protein is very filling. And so if you're only looking to make a very small change and have that change be a little bit more sustainable, I do recommend that you focus on protein and aiming for a third of your daily protein requirement, which typically looks like 30 to 40 grams of protein at breakfast. And then what we can do is we can focus on introducing carbs a little bit later on throughout the day. So breakfast should be high protein and high fats because that really helps to stabilize blood sugar and really helps with cortisol release at breakfast time, which is when we do want that cortisol to be high. And then as we progress through the day, to support that lovely fall in cortisol and to minimize the potential of further cortisol spikes, that's when we want to be introducing carbohydrates, and ideally complex carbohydrates in the form of vegetables and fruits. So one serving size at lunch, which is roughly the shape or the amount of your fist, and then 2 serving sizes at dinner for that beautiful kind of low cortisol throughout the evening. And then the other way that I like to think about kind of how we can structure meals is if you think about your plate, half of it should be vegetables, ideally, for that complex carbohydrates and also that amount of fiber that we do need for healthy bacteria in our gut, which is super important. We're not going to touch on that during this talk, except to say that there is a huge link between our gut microbiome and our cognitive and mental health. There's a lot of research showing that adequate fiber feeds our healthy gut microbiome, which then in turn produces a lot of the calming neurotransmitters like serotonin, GABA, that then crosses the blood-brain barrier. Okay, so half of our plate should be vegetables, and then the other half you could roughly think about as mostly protein and then a really liberal amount of healthy fats. So healthy fats meaning polyunsaturated fatty acids, things like avocado oil, avocados, grass-fed butter, nuts and seeds, cold water fish. The smaller the fish, the better, just to minimize heavy metal contamination. And then certainly decreasing the number of servings of trans fats or saturated fats would be ideal. All right, so what kind of movement when we're talking about movement for stress support? Basic rule of thumb is that exercise should feel invigorating, not exhausting. So if you go for a run or you go for a workout and you're depleted after, that means that we need to do all the other things, the nourishment from a dietary perspective, the rehabilitation of the adrenal glands from a supplement or herbal perspective before we start incorporating exercise, because you are in a state where exercise is actually adding to that cortisol release and not building muscle. And so if exercise is exhausting, do everything else and then maybe try exercise again in a few weeks and see how it goes. If you exercise and it feels invigorating, then great. It means you're in a place where your body is well nourished enough that you can actually be incorporating exercise. And this is what you should be focusing on. So the priority is strength training, ideally 3 to 4 times a week. Doesn't have to be super long, 30, 40 minutes per session is adequate. And the reason why strength training is so important is because it builds lean body mass, which helps with the blood sugar regulation, which then in turn helps with stress resilience and cortisol regulation. And then if that is in place, then you can go into more of the cardio workouts. So if you ever heard of the term zone 2 cardio, that's kind of what would be ideal. If you haven't, Google it. It essentially is referring to how much stress it's putting on your cardiovascular system. And it should be enough of a cardio workout where you can still maintain a conversation, but you cannot sing. That's kind of a rough gauge of a zone 2 kind of area in terms of cardiovascular stimulation. And so it can be anywhere between like a brisk walk to a light jog, depending on your cardiovascular fitness. And that's roughly 3 times a week, about 20 minutes 3 times a week. And then if you're able to do both of those, then that's where you can really look into high intensity training. And there is a newer term in social media and kind of in the general population, more of an awareness regarding a very specific form of high intensity training called REHIT. So this is referring to reduced exertion, high intensity interval training. And the reduced exertion, it really comes from research that has been showing that it doesn't have to be these HIIT workouts that are half an hour long. You can actually get very, very similar and comparable benefits in as little as 10 minutes. So that 10 minutes is comprised of 3 minutes of light warm up, like a walk, 30 seconds of all out full capacity exertion, and this can be in whatever form you want. So it could be running, it could be cycling, it could be swimming, it could be actually just doing something as easy as jumping jacks, or like knee highs, and doing kind of like stationary workouts. And then 3 minutes of recovery, so back to something like a light walk, another 30-second of all-out exertion, and then 3 minutes of recovery to wrap things up. So really, in total, 1 full minute of super, super high intensity interval training has been shown once to twice a week of this type of REHIT to be really, really beneficial in improving cardiovascular health and VO2 max and all of the indicators and markers of increased cardiovascular resistance. Okay, on to the bulk of the presentation. So all of the herbs that we would want to consider for stress, both helping us improve our response to stress in the short term, and then in the long term, protection against burnout. And there are 2 broad categories of herbs that I want you to think about: adaptogens and nervines. Adaptogens are exactly the way that they sound. There's the word adapt in them, and that's to really help your body to adapt to stress. So this is the category of herbs that are very, very safe, and often if you see a herbalist or a naturopathic doctor or a traditional Chinese medicine doctor, we would be prescribing adaptogens over the long term. So this speaks to their goal, but it also speaks to how long it takes for them to take effect. So adaptogens, you're not going to see a change overnight, but rather you're going to see a change over time. Nervines, on the other hand, some of them are very, very safe to be taken long term, but they have a much shorter onset of action, meaning that they can be used as needed for helping you decrease that sort of feeling of stress activation in the body. So any type of like heart racing, lack of focus, increase in anxiety, irritability, depression, all of those, you can use nervines to see shifts in the very, very short term. All right, so we'll go over some of these herbs. Adaptogens include things like mushrooms. They also include really beautiful herbs like ashwagandha, eleuthero, or ginseng. And then nervines include herbs like lemon balm, skullcap, St. John's wort, passion flower, valerian. We'll start off with the adaptogens. One of my favorites. So withania is a herb that I would say I prescribe to virtually everyone with long-term stress. And it works beautifully. It works via a few different mechanisms. It actually does decrease cortisol, so it really helps to calm that sort of fight or flight state of mind and body. But it also increases a neurotransmitter called GABA. GABA is a very calming neurotransmitter, so it will promote feelings of calm and well-being via these 2 different pathways. But the reason why I love ashwagandha is because it really helps to tonify our adrenal system, our HPA axis, but also our thyroid gland, which I know we haven't talked about so far, but it's the part of our body that is impacted and has a very intimate relationship with our adrenal glands. So there's the HPA axis, and then the HPA axis actually does impact our thyroid function as well. So sometimes we do think about it as the HPTA axis. And the thyroid gland is in charge of making thyroid hormones, and those do impact things like our metabolism, our propensity towards weight loss, weight gain, our digestive system. And so this is just a beautiful herb that really supports full body functioning. It really helps to calm the mind. I sometimes dose this at bedtime because it can really help with sleep as a result of that GABA promoting effect. And it pairs really well, honestly, with any of the other herbs that we'll talk about today. Eleuthero. So this is Siberian ginseng. It's not a real ginseng like ginseng panax or ginseng like the Chinese herb ginseng, but we do call it false ginseng. So it's another adaptogen that's really, really beautiful, very, very safe for most people. One that is paired oftentimes in supplements with withania, and it's because it has very similar mechanisms of actions in the body. It helps to tonify the adrenal glands. It has some slightly additive or kind of synergistic effects to withania. It is an immune tonic as well, which withania isn't as much, and it balances the cardiovascular and nervous system. So really helping with that sort of intimate relationship that you feel when you feel stressed, and then you feel kind of like that racing heartbeat, the heart palpitations. It really helps to calm that down. So a really beautiful herb as well. And then just a really quick mention that you'll notice the structure of the slides. There are products, the Harmonic Arts products highlighted in the bottom left-hand corner. So this is to show you all of the products in the Harmonic Arts lineup that contains the herb that we're currently talking about. So you'll notice that the Adapt tea blend, which is a loose leaf tea, has withania, eleuthero, as well as some other herbs. And so if you're looking for more of like an introduction to herbs, especially to adaptogens, that might be a really nice one as opposed to the single formulations like the standalone tinctures. But if you're already kind of a pro and you have a little bit of a dispensary at home, the tinctures might be a really nice add-on. All right. Reishi. So all of the mushrooms are adaptogenic, and the reason why we touch on reishi in this webinar is because it is specifically really great at supporting stress response. So it's adaptogenic for the adrenal glands, it's immunomodulating, so helping with that sort of long-term detrimental impact of stress on suppressing immune function, helping to kind of mitigate that as much as possible. It does have a little bit of an antimicrobial, antipathogenic property, so you do have to be cautious from a digestive standpoint regarding kind of the effects on the gut microbiome. And this is kind of part of the reason why I do love talking about herbs generally, but also recommending that you reach out to someone who is well versed in herbs if you are planning on taking herbs long term. And the beauty about the Harmonic Arts products, so the 5 mushrooms cacao blend, the capsules, the tinctures, the loose powders, is that they are dual extraction for reishi. And why that's important, so both a water extraction and an ethanol or alcohol extraction, is because there are different compounds in mushrooms. There are polysaccharides or carbohydrates that only come out in water, and then there are alcohol extractable compounds like triterpenes and reishi. They're really, really important as well. And if you're getting only one or the other, then you're not getting the full complement of these different compounds. So as an example, the polysaccharides or the beta-D-glucans that are water soluble have an immune stimulating effect, but they're also really anti-tumor, hypoglycemic, meaning they really help to decrease blood sugar levels, and then they're really tonic for the cardiovascular system. Whereas other compounds in reishi, like the nucleotides and the triterpenes, have more of that adaptogenic effect on the adrenal glands. And then they also have other additional properties like really adaptogenic for our musculoskeletal system and really helping with decreasing muscle fatigue as well. All right, so adaptogens, reminder, long-term use really appropriate, but also long-term use needed for full benefits. And then nervines can be used as needed, have a really, really kind of immediate onset of action. So you definitely can feel the benefits even with one-time use, but long-term use can also be safe. So the very first nervine that we'll touch on is St. John's wort. And this is kind of like nature's SSRI, or nature's antidepressive. So an SSRI is a class of drug that helps serotonin float around a little bit longer in the brain, helps to decrease the breakdown of serotonin or resorption of serotonin. And serotonin is a feel-good neurotransmitter. St. John's wort is a natural SSRI, so really helpful for mild to moderate depression, either standalone or secondary to long-term stress. Really helpful for seasonal affective disorder. And because it has that SSRI like action in the brain, there are considerations that are really important. If you're currently already on an SSRI, so this would be like a pharmaceutical like citalopram, escitalopram, or you're considering starting an SSRI, you definitely want to be speaking to your healthcare provider regarding the fact that you are considering or already on St. John's wort, because too many SSRIs used at the same time or too high of a dose of SSRI can definitely have some really, really significant side effects, something known as serotonin syndrome. So something to watch out for. It can definitely impact how SSRIs are metabolized in the body. Lemon balm is a beautiful calming nervine. It really helps to lift your mood. It increases dopamine, which is the neurotransmitter responsible for focus. So really helpful for kind of calm focus. If you feel like you're someone who experiences agitation after being stressed and the inability to focus on the task at hand, this is where lemon balm can be really useful. It's non-sedating, but it does help sleep by that calming effect on the nervous system. So it can be used any time of the day. It doesn't necessarily have to be reserved at bedtime by any means. And you can use it as a tincture, you can use it as a tea. I love it as a tea because it has a very lovely taste, a little bit citrusy. And so a beautiful herb and a very easy herb to grow as well if you want to try growing this over the next few months. Passion flower is a beautiful herb that calms the body and mind, similarly to lemon balm, not sedating, but very calming on the central nervous system, very helpful for anxiety and insomnia when used leading up to bedtime, and is dose dependent for that sort of more soporific effect. So if you use higher doses, it can definitely be a little bit more soporific, although I do find that people love it because it doesn't give them the morning after groggy effect that some other more sedating herbs can. So lots of research on passion flower and insomnia, anxiety, and then as well as ADHD. Skullcap is a herb that I prescribe really often in tincture form in my practice because it is a really great anxiolytic or anxiety reducer. So this is if you're someone who feels a lot of physiological symptoms of anxiety. So if you ever feel like you're a little bit twitchy, jumpy, if you're sensitive to noise, if you experience like circuitous thought patterns like incessant worrying that's preventing you from falling asleep, this is where skullcap can be really helpful as a combination tincture for a bedtime sleepiness. Really great on its own as well, but I do really love it specifically as a combination herb. And then lastly, in the nervine category would be valerian. So valerian is a little bit stronger. It's a little bit more sedating. This one I definitely would reserve for bedtime use. I wouldn't use this during the day. And it is very helpful for increasing GABA and for helping with relaxation, both in the central nervous system, but as well as in the body as a muscular relaxant. But because it has that sedating property, and then also because I found from a clinical perspective that not everyone reacts to valerian in the way that you would expect them to. Some people do have a paradoxical reaction to valerian where they actually get a little bit more awake and a little bit more alert after using it. You do want to try a small dose first, and then if you tolerate it well, this is where a combination tincture like the Feel Calm tincture is lovely because it has valerian as the primary herb, but a lot of supporting herbs like the skullcap and the passion flower mixed in with it as well. So the owner of Harmonic Arts has this analogy or this comparison where he calls skullcap and passion flower the salt and pepper, and kind of more of a softening effect in terms of seasoning effect on the valerian. So when combined together, valerian, skullcap, and passion flower, the more sort of sedating effects of valerian can be mitigated and softened. And so we don't often find that we need as high of a dose in order to achieve the calming properties of valerian. As a reminder, lots of different options: tinctures, teas, loose powders, capsules. So this is really a choose your own venture. You can definitely see what resonates a little bit more. Some people prefer capsules for the ease, but I do find loose powders lovely because you can add them to your own lattes, you can add them to bone broths or to soups and kind of mask the taste a little bit more if you do find the tinctures a little bit too overpowering. And with that, I'm going to pass the floor over to Amanda. She's just going to make a little announcement. Thank you very much for your time. I so appreciate you joining us for the last half hour over your lunch break. And if you do have any questions, you can find me at that link, clementinenaturalhealth.com. That's the name of my practice in Vancouver. Thank you again.
Thank you, Emma. That was incredible. So much great information. I wanted to share with everyone that Harmonic Arts is having a site-wide sale that starts tomorrow, the 15th of January, and lasts until January 21st, and it is up to 20% off site-wide. So do check that out. Everyone here will be also sent a recording of the webinar today. And if you have any questions, please feel free to add them to our chat, and Emma can answer any questions. So thank you for joining us today. We'll stay on here for a few minutes and see if there's any questions that come up.
Thank you so much, Amanda. I'm just going to remind you that I can't see the chat. So if you could please read out the questions as they come through, and then I'd be more than happy to answer.
Yes. Someone did say that asking if would yoga or walking be an okay exercise to start to get moving.
Yes, I love yoga. I love walking. I love anything that connects you to your breath. Half an hour is really not adequate. There's so much more that we can dive into from a dietary and lifestyle and herbal perspective for stress support. But deep belly breathing or diaphragmatic breathing is a practice that I talk about frequently. And it's something that can really help calm your nervous system because one of the largest nerves in our body, which is called the vagus nerve that runs from our brainstem, it runs down to our digestive system through our diaphragm, which is the muscle that sits at the base of the lungs. And when we do these deep belly breaths, it allows that diaphragm to contract fully and release fully, having a very calming massage-like action on that vagus nerve, and it sends a signal back to the brain to toggle the nervous system back into a rest and digest mode. So it's one of the most powerful, takes 3 to 5 breaths to complete, cheapest ways of getting our nervous system back into that rest and digest or a parasympathetic mode of activation. So I do love yoga and I do love walking, especially if you're also getting that added benefit of walking outside in nature.
Thank you for that, Emma. Here is a question. Is there a maximum amount of use of valerian?
Yeah, that is a great question. Most likely, and very, very individual. So I don't know off the top of my head what the maximum safety is from a herbal safety perspective, but I do find that individuals will learn what their maximum tolerated valerian dose would be through trial and error when you're first starting valerian. Some people are a little bit more sensitive to it and they'll notice more of a morning after groggy effect with higher doses of valerian that for other people might be totally fine. So that's part of the reason why I recommend start low. And if you feel okay, then you can kind of increase until that sweet spot where you do feel like it gives you that sleepy effect, but you're not noticing any increase morning after effects. And then another really common side effect of either a paradoxical reaction to the valerian or too high of a dose of valerian is really vivid dreams. So you can also watch for that as well.
Regarding Harmonic Arts products, such as the Feel Calm tincture, which is a blend that has valerian as well as skullcap and passion flower. And what's nice about blends is when in a formula, the effects of valerian can soften with it being paired with passion flower and skullcap. So Feel Calm is a tincture that can be helpful for anxiety, to calm muscle tension, and can be used throughout the day in a small dose, or it can be used in the full daily dose, which I believe is 1 meal 3 times a day. And if you take 3 meals at bedtime, then it can be used more as a sleep aid. So something to consider when thinking about taking valerian. Okay, another question here is, what is your favorite way to administer ashwagandha?
Oh, great question. I prefer capsules or tablets. If you like loose powders, you can for sure try and add a little bit of loose powder into something savory. I do find ashwagandha has a slightly bitter taste that you can still taste. So I prefer like a powder, oh, sorry, a capsule, a tablet. And the tinctures are also great.
Is there also a max dose that you would suggest with ashwagandha?
Yeah, so max doses are a little bit hard to answer because it really depends on the extraction method. So, as an example, a 1-for-1 extraction as a tincture has a very different max dose in terms of mils compared to like a 1-to-3 extraction. Or when we're talking about capsules and tablets, it's often reported as like the milligrams of the active constituents, so with analytes. So it really depends on the actual product that you're purchasing. And this is part of the reason why having someone guide you through your supplements regimen would be really beneficial because they would be much more well versed and then also just aware of what they're recommending.
There's a question here in regards to lemon balm and thyroid issues, and if there's any concern about taking taking lemon balm with thyroid issues.
Yeah, that's a great question. So at lower doses, not really, but it does point out a very, very astute, I think, line of consideration, which is that there are extracts that are a little bit higher in active constituents of lemon balm that can interact with thyroid function. So this would be something that I would reserve for like a healthcare practitioner, a naturopathic doctor, a herbalist, to really kind of guide you through. So if you already are aware of a pre-existing thyroid condition, depending on whether or not it's hypothyroidism, lemon balm can sometimes have a little bit of an effect on thyroid function, but definitely not one of the top concerning herbs that I'm usually thinking about with thyroid dysfunction.
Okay, and the last question here is there any concern with taking Eleuthero before bed and if it would interfere with sleep?
Yeah, it can. And this is where I do see a lot of variation from person to person. For really, really sensitive individuals, it certainly can. For a lot of people, they don't notice a difference and they do take it kind of both morning and bedtime for that long-term adaptogenic effect. But I typically do in my own practice am quite conservative when I first start someone on Luthro or any active constituent. And so I do typically follow that guideline of if it's a little bit more of a stimulating adaptogen, I first trial them during the day. And then if they really do need it because they're quite depleted as a twice per day dosing, then we can try that as well.
Thank you, Emma, for that. That's all the questions. And I thought it would be nice if you want to just end with sharing about your practice that's based in Vancouver and that you are available for virtual or in-person appointments, but just what your practice focuses on.
Thank you for that invitation. So I do see people virtually and in person as long as you are a resident of British Columbia. That's all that matters. And I primarily see women's health and specifically perimenopause and menopause. So I see everything about perimenopause and menopause. If you are in your 40s and 50s and are interested in seeing a naturopathic doctor regarding could it be hormones, could it be something else, I would welcome you to reach out. And then the other piece of my practice is eczema. So I see a lot of pediatrics as well as adult patients with eczema, atopic dermatitis. And so if you have a child and you're concerned about their skin rash, you can also bring them to see me.
Thank you, Emma, so much. And thank you for everyone joining us today. I hope you all have a beautiful rest of your day. Goodbye.